like not like revenue, but like the commercial.
Yeah. So sad.
I'm thinking of something.
We were growing into salads.
We're lecturing on a
Yes, so that we can have our last lecture for this class. And then next week, we'll give your presentations on Tuesday, and Krista from over in chemistry will come in and talk to us about medicinal plants Thursday. We'll be wrapped up. Yeah. Also, this means that you'll now have covered all the lecture material that will be on your lecture.
Oh, what is that lecture?
That was all
Are you in all of our questions?
I mean, that's
what I'm here for, right?
Where, when, why?
I just feel like we've talked about so much since our last quiz. I'm like, I don't even remember.
We really have, yeah. And I want to wrap up early so we have time to sort of tie it all together and kind of use that to review.
All I know is I want to.
Yeah, that one I know. That one. And the ginkgo, that one will always be stuck in the head.
Yeah. Okay. All right, so I think everybody just heard me, but this is going to be our last lecture. So today we're going through Eudicots. So for the next couple of classes, we'll look at examples, do some more lavish stuff. You'll give your presentations, and we're going to have Krista from over in chemistry come and talk to us about some medicinal plants. So that should be fun. We also have maybe a picnic on our schedule. We'll see how the weather cooperates with that. Okay, so today we're going to go through some selected Eudicots. There are an awful lot of them, so we won't get to them all, but I've selected some of the families that you probably seen, because you've eaten them, or that you might see out in the field as you're looking for your plant collections. So I'll take a look. Okay, so our Eudicots are our last group. So we have covered all the different types of plants up until now. So here's our chart. So we're way at the bottom now. We're actually going to skip this group. They're not very important. They're just some more pond weeds. All right, so if you wanted to see them, they're these pond plants. They're called coontails or hornworts commonly. And really their only importance is that they're a sister group to Eudicots. You might have some in an aquarium or something like that. If you find them very important and you want to argue with me, I am open to those arguments. I don't have any important facts about them for you. I'm sure someone who does research on them does. Okay, so a reminder about our dicots. So we've seen some plants that look a little like dicots before, used to be classified with our dicots. Those magnolias used to be in this group. So we talked about some of these characteristics before. We expect to see two cotyledons, so these two embryonic leaves. The veins on the leaves are usually going to be net-like, so they're going to be branching out from each other. If we were to cut the stem, we'd see that our vasculature, our vascular bundles, that xylem and phloem, going to be arranged in a ring, which is why we're going to find most of our trees in this group. Because trees annually grow rings, which is why we can count tree rings in order to count the tree's age. Likely have a taproot, although there's some variation here. Our floral parts are going to be in multiples of 4 or 5. If we were to cut a root, we'd see that we have this X-like kind of structure in the center with the xylem and phloem. So I have an example of a eudicot on each of your tables. So I'd like you to take a look and see what features of this you can or can't see. And when you're done with it, pass it to another table because I think only on 2 of these can you see cotyledons. But fun fact, you can see it on two of them. And if you happen to know what your plant is, tell your group.
It looks like it's-
These are all from my windowsill. You can eat all of them.
Oh, so
Yeah, it is.
that is what it is. I was gonna say, that's what it looks like. Yeah. Does it smell like me? Yeah.
You don't have to feel dumb. It's not grown yet.
I need a little tiny. It's not like a strong.
All right. So those are those two embryonic foods.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so. Did you guys know what this thing is?
See, I always saw that. Yeah, that's like the only thing.
So this is actually.
Like the benefits. Yeah, that was.
This one I thought was gonna die. This I got from Devin. I took out all the roots, found one little white piece,
Oh.
buried it in dirt. I loved it about that. Yeah, so if you're done looking trade with another table,
Okay, so I should.
or yeah, I guess cycle them around. Might make sense. Yeah. So send it that way.
Guess what it is?
These are our Yeah. So is this familiar to any of you?
So like these.
So you can eat this? Huh? Do you know what it is?
Oh.
Literally just like something.
It's so little.
So you can see the cotyledons on this one as well. So they're
I see it started.
Yeah, they're those like embryonic sort of starter leaves, basically. So when you look at plants growing up and embryo, you transplant them on after you see the first leaves, that's what it's talking about. Like those first two little cotyledons that popped out are not. So, our gardening and seed out instructions. Yeah, exactly.
Is it? It's so tiny. It's so good.
Yeah. My mother left some seeds.
Yeah, I can't.
They're not gonna go outside.
I like the little lemon seed.
Like a lemon.
Like,
I have a lemon tree in my back. It's small. I gave my sister a lemon tree for Christmas. I don't have no lemon tree.
a lemon tree.
Until my mother did give me a lemon tree for my
If
birthday.
you have a lemon, can you plant the seeds when they're wet, or should you wait until you like grow? Like clean them.
That matters. Yeah, you have to wait till they dry, but yeah, you can plant them.
Probably do it on like a towel when you can like wash them.
Yeah, my dad planted a grapefruit tree when we first immigrated. He took me to grapefruit for his first breakfast in France. And then dropped the seed in the dirt. It's like ceiling height. We have to deliberately not repot it because it's like at the ceiling. Yeah, I take it outside in summer and then afterwards I cut it down. No, it's never grown grapefruit, which is the message. I think it's older than me.
Yeah.
Something must be wrong. But it's a survivor. No, we're about to get the don't say that. It doesn't want to make you sad. I'm gonna make like clap on my back. There's stuff like like there are people in this world now that you don't have any clue. One more time, are you doing okay?
I was sitting in the car with my friend. It's celebrating their 21st birthday. And I played this right side and she didn't know that song.
You snacking on this one too? Like, I'm very proud of this one because and it came back. Well, I made it come back. All the roots were dead. It's about like 1 centimeter around it. It looked like a healthy dead. I was like, we'll try. It spreads really.
What kind of mint?
Peppermint. That's why I tried to say that. I feel like you always see spearmint in there.
Yeah,
Sometimes
and
the
they're peppermint.
You don't like peppermint? No, I am a fan of peppermint. That's why that's why I tried to save it so hard. So like I'm gonna grow it. No way. This one's up until they didn't plant it. And it's been growing for a while. Yeah. So when it first turned from a seed, you would have seen those two seals, those two embryonic seeds. So it's for several years. Okay. Okay. Cool. So hopefully looking at those emphasized to you like what a cotyledon would look like. And if you've ever done any planting things from seeds in your own gardens or in your house, you might now realize that many of the things that we plant are dicots. They have those first 2 little seed leaves that come out before the plant grows its true leaves, which are the ones that are going to have a potentially more complex shape, net-like veins, and so on. The cotyledons, when they pop out, are really just linear, just kind of have that one line down the center, because they're not the true leaf of the plant. Just to review from last time, a monocot wouldn't have those 2 cotyledons. It would just come up like one blade of grass, basically. So these are eudicots, which they've separated from the magnolias, which used to be in the dicot group. The only really consistently observable difference that I can find, other than the molecular data, is that the pollen grain shape is different. So you see this sort of 3-parted pollen. It's called tricolpate pollen in the eudicots. But here's an example of what magnolia pollen grain looks like, and you can see it's very different from that structure. So you wouldn't really be able to key in on this characteristic in the field unless you had a microscope with you. Okay, so we're going to go through some familiar groups. Most of the leafy trees around here, right, are going to be eudicots. It's these eudicots. The dicots are the ones that grow in rings and have that annual growth outward. Right? We talked about monocot, quote unquote, trees, or really palm trees. They have a really different structure and don't have that kind of annual growth. If you think about your maples, your oaks, your birches, all of those are going to be in this group. So when you are making your collections, if you bring me any twigs, you are probably going to be looking at a Eudicot. We have a lot of annual plants in this group as well, and some herbaceous plants. So sunflowers, dandelions, cabbage, apples, tomatoes, beans, lots of things you eat and grow are Eudicots. So here we see what they look like sprouting up with those two cotyledons. So we don't know what this particular sprout is because it hasn't given off its true leaves. So there's no point really in describing its leaf shape. You'll see a sunflower because I like to have pictures on slides. You know, give you something to look at, not just words. Okay, so Eudicot phylogeny is quite complex. So this is just grouping out the orders in the Eudicots, not even at the family level. So you can see that there are an awful lot of them. Here's a slightly simplified phylogeny on the left-hand side, but we're really just going to focus in on kind of two big groups, the rosids and the asterids. We're going to talk a little bit about this sister group to the rosids, the Saxifragillalis. So if we're trying to tell apart rosids and asterids, what we want to look at are the petals, really. So if we look at the flower shape of a rosid, we're going to see that they're polypetalous. So they have several petals that are going to be separate from each other, whereas the asterids are going to be sympatalous. So those petals are going to be coming together and kind of fusing. So that's going to be a main difference that we can key in on here. Okay. So we're going to talk very briefly about the one group we want to think about that's not either of those, the Saxifragillalis. Okay. The reason we're going to mention it is, one, we have an example that grows around here, the gooseberry. So the gooseberry plant, after which Gooseberry Falls is named, right? So if you went up there, you'll probably find some of this. In the family Grossulariaceae, looks like this. But plenty of things that don't look like a gooseberry are also in this group, including the jade plant in the family Crassulaceae. So I don't know if we almost certainly have one of these up in the greenhouse. You have probably seen this before. It's a common house plant. One of the reasons we want to think about this one is it's a good opportunity to talk a little bit about photosynthesis, because there's a specific type of photosynthesis that's named after this family of plants, although we do see it in other families. Okay. All right. So in general, the idea of photosynthesis, which we are not going to go into all the biochemical details of, because I'm not super into chemistry. But the basic idea, right, is plants are taking carbon dioxide and water along with solar energy, and they're converting that into glucose and oxygen. So glucose they can then use to produce ATP that the plant can use for energy for its processes. Okay, so all plants have to do this. This is why they're green from the chlorophyll that is involved in this photosynthesis process. Because the plants need to do gas exchange here, so they need to take in carbon dioxide, and they need to give off oxygen. They don't have lungs, right? They don't have a mouth. They have these structures on their leaves called stomata. So they have little holes, little openings in the plant leaf that allow the carbon dioxide in and the oxygen out. This presents a problem though in super hot and dry conditions. Okay. So this is because water can evaporate out of these stomata, right? So you don't want that if you're in some kind of desert or something. And I should briefly ask, is the group that was going to talk about succulents going deep into CAM photosynthesis? Okay, I'm just going to very briefly mention it as we're doing this group. Okay. But basically you need to conserve water. And one of the ways you can do this is more efficiently use CO2 so that you can leave the stomata closed more.
So in the crassulacean acid metabolism found in Crassulaceae and other groups, the plants open the stomata just at night because it's cooler at night. You don't have the sun shining down. You don't have the heat that would cause the water to evaporate, at least not as much. But in order to do this, this means that they're only taking in carbon dioxide at night, but they do want to do photosynthesis during the day because the daytime is when there's the sunlight that they can actually convert into glucose. Right, so they're not going to be doing the photosynthesis at night while the stomata are open. This means they need to store the CO2. So they store it as a compound called phthalate, and then they can release that CO2 again into their cells during the day in order to do photosynthesis. So that's one way we can adapt to a hot, dry climate. Most plants, so the normal way of doing photosynthesis is they do something called C3 photosynthesis. So they take the carbon from CO2, sorry. Carbon from CO2 gets fixed into a 3-carbon molecule during the process of photosynthesis. The problem this is going to present if you have your stomata closed, though, is that while we're producing this 3-carbon molecule, oxygen builds up in the cells because it can't escape through closed stomata. Right? If we close that pore, the oxygen can't get out, like the plant can't breathe out. And that buildup of oxygen inhibits photosynthesis. So photosynthesis, this doesn't work as well when there's high oxygen concentration relative to the concentration of carbon dioxide. So I'm mentioning that because there's another way of getting around this problem, which is through C4 photosynthesis. So C4 photosynthesis, mainly people talk about it when they talk about corn, which is why that's in all caps. But it's present actually in 40% of monocots and some dicots, found something like 4% of dicots. So we're really talking about it here just to separate it from chem photosynthesis, which is going on in the Crassulaceae. But basically this alternative way of getting around the bad effects of that oxygen buildup is that instead of fixing the carbon as a 3-carbon molecule, it gets fixed as a 4-carbon molecule, and CO2 gets transported into a different group of cells. So instead of saying in the cells that are surrounding the stomata, they get moved, the CO2 gets moved into bundled sheath cells, which are just some cells around the leaf vein. And this means that when the oxygen builds up, when stomata are closed, it's building up in those layers of cells near the stomata. But we have CO2 in other parts of the plant, specifically in those bundled sheath cells. So the photosynthesis can happen there instead because we don't have that buildup of oxygen in that spot. And so if this is confusing, because I always find chemistry a little confusing the first time I think about it, there's a very short video for comparing how these are. Okay. So we're going to go back to the lipids. So among our rosids, so these are the polypetalous ones, the one with the separate petals, we have a couple of different groups. But one of the really important ones are the fabates, and specifically because we have something called nitrogen fixers in this group. So they're specifically going to be in one, mainly we talk about them in association with one family that we'll get to, but it's the Fabaceae for which this group is named. So these beans and other legumes are going to be nitrogen fixers, and we'll take a brief look at how that works. But there are going to be other things in this group as well. So Rosales is an order in this group that includes roses, but also apples, cherries, all sorts of other fruits. Cucurbitalis includes squashes, cucumbers, melons, and then a bunch of our trees are in the Agalis group, which includes oaks, birches, walnuts, and a lot of other things that I'm obviously not mentioning based on that really large phylogeny. Okay. So, nitrogen fixers. When we think about nitrogen fixers, we are usually thinking about the family Fabaceae, which are our legumes. Here I've
showing you a pea plant. You can recognize a legume or a member of this family largely by these pods that they have. So when you see a long pod with a bunch of seeds inside, that's an indicator that we're looking at a member of the family Fabaceae. So beans are in this group as well, but there are a bunch of trees that have structures that you see like this as well. So this family has formed a really cool symbiotic relationship with soil bacteria that allow it to fix nitrogen. When I say fix nitrogen, I really mean is that nitrogen in the air is in the form of N2, which is pretty inert. So plants really can't use N2. So it's not bioavailable, but they do need nitrogen. Right? That's why we put fertilizer on crops, right? Is because we need to. One of the reasons is because we need to give those plants nitrogen, and they can't use it in the form it is in the air all around us. So our nitrogen fixers are going to be able, through their symbiotic relationship with a bacteria, to convert that nitrogen in the form of N2 into other forms that are usable. Okay. So here we see the nitrogen cycle overall. Nitrogen has to get fixed. One of the ways that can happen is through lightning, but usually we're getting nitrogen into the soil from fertilizer, from manure, and through planting some of these nitrogen fixing plants. So when we think about like crop rotation, this is one of the reasons we would do that, is to put some type of crop that is able to fix nitrogen and alternate that with crops that use a lot of nitrogen but can't fix it. So if you look at a nitrogen fixing plant, one of the places we would look is at its root system. So in the root system of nitrogen fixing plants, you're going to find these little nodules on the roots. And these nodules are where we have bacteria that are taking in nitrogen in that form of N2, and they're converting it into ammonia. So that step, that fixing, that converting process is happening within these nodules. So good way to get nitrogen to the soil is to plant some nitrogen fixers along with your other plants. Otherwise, you're gonna need to put down a bunch of fertilizer. So other Fabales, so other members of this order, that's important, but you might see them or you might hear about them. One of them that we have a lot of around here, unfortunately, is buckthorn. So buckthorn is within the family Rhamnaceae. It's super, super invasive. It's not great for our local environment. It's not native to here. And this is what it looks like. You've probably seen it walking around in the summer. It has these black berries, and it literally has thorns on the twigs, which is why we call it buckthorn. And it's really hard to get rid of. I know sometimes we have community day events like picking it, burning it, trying to dig up all its roots. We're putting in effort to try and restore the natural ecosystems. Another one that you might think about is elm. So we don't have as much of elm anymore because lots and lots of elms have died of Dutch elm disease. So if you have an elm, you have to like try and vaccinate it or treat it against this disease. It's a fungus spread by beetles that can go from tree to tree and spread this disease. So elms used to be really commonly planted as street plants. They're really pretty. They live a long time, but in about the 30s or so, they all started dying off as these beetles and Dutch elm disease came over. Another family here is the Cannabaceae. So that does include marijuana. That's why it's named this, for the cannabis. But there are some other plants that you may see. So hackberry is a tree that you'll probably see around here. This bark is pretty characteristic. This kind of cork-like looking bark. It grows some little green and then black berries in the summer. Hops is also in this family. So hops is a vine. So it has these sort of serrated leaves and these cool flowers that we use for beer making. Just a list of some other families, some other plants that you might see around here. So if you're looking for plants to collect, you might look up what some of these look like, basically. I would expect that the nettles and the violets might come up, although I think it's planning to be with here forever. Okay. So that brings us to the family for which the rosids are named, the Rosaceae, which are in the order Rosales. So this is important basically because it's a bunch of the fruits we eat. So there were some tropical fruits we listed in the monocots, but a lot of the fruits we eat are Eudicots, and a lot of them are in this family Rosaceae. So you might have written down this word a bunch when we did our fruit swap. So this includes strawberries, this includes thimbleberries, this includes raspberries, blackberries, also includes anything that looks like a cherry, like plum, like an apple, like a pear, right? All these plants in this picture are within the family Rosaceae, as are the roses. So not a ton of common characteristics or a lot of synanthomorphies that I could find listed out. But in general, you're going to see that the flowers are kind of showy, kind of pretty, right? Roses are pretty. You'll see the flowers of, I really like blackberry flowers. I think they smell really nice. Apple flowers are good. They're going to have 5 petals, 5 sepals. They look pretty characteristically like this. They also are going to have a hypanthium, which I have a reminder of what that is on the next slide, I believe. One thing that is interesting about this family, other than the fact that we eat a lot of species within this family, is that many of the seeds contain a compound called amygdalin. So if you've ever heard that you shouldn't eat apple seeds, this is why. So amygdalin, when you digest it, can release cyanide. So that's what people are concerned about when they tell you not to eat an apple seed. It's also commonly found in cherry pits, in almond seeds, apricot seeds. I don't think it's actually all that dangerous. I think you'd have to eat an awful lot of apple seeds in order to get cyanide poisoning. I've definitely eaten apples entirely whole, the whole thing, and I'm fine. But that's where it comes from. And if you smell cyanide, I hear it has a scent of almonds, and this is kind of why. It's that same kind of compound. I have not smelled cyanide, so can't confirm through personal experience. So the hypanthium that we're looking at, these are all examples of what the flower cross-section would look like of different individuals within the Rosaceae. So the hypanthium is this floral cup underneath, right? So we did a rose when we did our flower dissection. So we saw that hypanthium below where our sepals and petals are attaching. Now we're going to move to a different group, still within the rosids, but happens to be phylogenetically separate. The malvids. So the most important order to know here, I'd say, is the brassicales, which are technically known as like our mustard family. Mostly what we're growing is not actually mustard. The most common plants within this group that you'll see are cabbage, cauliflower, kale, broccoli, Brussels sprouts. I don't think you see kohlrabi that often, but these are actually all the same exact species, which is super cool, right? And it's especially cool because this happened through selective breeding, right? So they're from one species, Brassica oleracea, and they've been modified through farming techniques, right? Through selective breeding to emphasize one particular part of the plant. A wild mustard plant or a wild type of this species looks really different, right? Like it has a long skinny stem, has a couple leaves, but not that many, has these big yellow flowers. But if you increase the size of the stem significantly. That's how we got kohlrabi. Emphasizing and breeding for really large leaves gave us kale. Going for flower buds and some stem gave us broccoli. Same thing for cauliflower, but I guess I picked a different flower color for the cauliflower. Going for leaf buds gives you the Brussels sprouts, so that's what you're eating when you're eating a Brussels sprout. And cabbage is actually the terminal leaf bud rather than the lateral leaf buds, rather than the side ones. But they're all the same thing. So if you hear someone talk about brassicas or cruciferous vegetables, this is what they're talking about. They're talking about this family, and specifically, they're usually talking about this species that we eat a lot of in these different forms. That brings us to the asterids. So the asterids are sympetals, so they're going to have fused petals. So they are often thought of as adapted for pollination. The flowers are going to be in little clusters. The flowers are relatively small, at least some of them. So some families we want to know here are the Solanaceae. It's a really big one. It includes tomatoes, potatoes, eggplants, and peppers. Picked out the Lamiaceae because I brought you an example today. So mint, but also sage, thyme, basil, lots of herbs are within this group. And then I picked out the Ericaceae because we have blueberries around here and I like blueberries. Okay. So we're starting with the Solanaceae, and I think this would be, if you're going to remember one asterid, I would remember this family, the Solanaceae. So they're often referred to as the nightshades because they do include nightshade and deadly nightshade within this group. So for a while, people were actually quite worried about eating like potatoes and tomatoes because they saw this resemblance to the nightshades. They might poison you. So many foods and also different types of drugs are included in this family. But some familiar examples are potatoes, eggplants, tomatoes, peppers, but also tobacco, belladonna are within this family. So if we're looking for general characteristics, actually, I'm going to flip back real quick. This flower like really looks like a nightshade, and when I'm walking around, I find that there's something about the general feel of this flower that is really recognizable. So I am going to mention a couple of traits on the next slide, but really just internalizing the vibe of this flower, I think is the best way to recognize something in the family Solanaceae. So general characteristics, if you're trying to list them out, are that we have alternate leaves. The leaves are often going to be hairy, so they're going to be pubescent. They're often going to be fragrant. If you've ever like picked a tomato leaf, you know, it has a very particular smell. Or even just the tomato stems at the grocery store, if you ever get one of the stems. The flowers have 5 petals and 5 sepals. I feel that really fully adequately describes the shape I'm trying to emphasize, but if you counted them, that's what you get to. The poisonous compound that they have inside them is something called solanine. So that can occur in basically all parts of the plant. So it can occur in the leaves, can occur in the fruit, can occur in the tubers. But in the plants that we eat, it's not really a problem. So I wouldn't be too worried. Sometimes people say you shouldn't eat like raw potatoes. That's not true. You can eat raw potatoes. Don't worry about the common food plants just because they're in the nightshade family. But if you do go find one out in the wild and you're like, oh, this kind of looks like a tomato, that's the point at which you want to not eat that and figure out what you're looking at. Next, we have our mints. They're members of the family Lamiaceae. So these are a bunch of different types of herbs. So mint, also basil, rosemary, thyme, sage. So we can recognize these by their simple opposite leaves. Really looking for that fragrance is going to be super helpful. And the flowers have a very specific looking structure when we look at them. So the flowers are going to be in clusters, and the petals get fused into kind of an upper and a lower lip. So they're going to be zygomorphic, so they're going to have bilateral symmetry. And if you look at the stem, it's going to be kind of square in cross section often. So probably noticed that on the myth I brought in. Finally, blueberries in the family Ericaceae. So the one especially cool thing I wanted to mention about them is that they have a symbiosis with mycorrhizal fungi. So mushrooms kind of that help them grow in poor soils, which is true about a number of different plants. So there are a lot of associations between different types of plants and fungi and things in our forests around us that help plants grow. Things that look like this are going to be in this family. So blueberries, cranberries, huckleberries, but also things like heather, which is kind of like a black. You see it more as a flower. The wintergreen, which you see mainly for the leaves, are in this family. I didn't find that it's a synapomorphy, but when I'm looking for these out in the woods, I look for this kind of crown-like structure on the end of them. I find that's pretty typical of this group. Typical of plants that are safe to eat, although I don't eat them just because I said that. Okay. So I'll go ahead and look back at the mint just to check if you can see these characteristics for that family. And that's pretty much what we're doing for today. It's short, but a lot of material is what I think. So, yeah. Do the stem seed square on that one? I have the stem seed small.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Kind of like with the
I'm gonna.
so that's there.
I think so. Heidi's been along on Tuesday, so she was wondering.
Okay, let's get through this. Yeah, we're gonna.
Sounds the same thing.
Yeah.
But the dicot is
It's just a larger grouping. Yeah. We're going to try to do it on Tuesday if we. Depends how much time it is.
It's the newest term. Like,
Okay.
oh, sorry.
Like, can you both send me an email of what your topics were?
Heidi said she emailed you. I don't know. I got it.
I'll search my email.
I just threw my phone forward on it. Apparently. She's tossed her phone. She's seen it.
Thank you.
See you later. Have fun on Saturday. Oh, thanks. Psychology.
Oh, hey, I was gonna ask.
I set up
But yeah, that's why I'm pulling out families, right? Because I said pick three families.
Yeah.
So I'm like,
Yeah, I was like,
here's how you find a family.
these are the same family.
Yeah.
So, yeah, okay.
I don't think it should be hard, right? Like if you had a gymnosperm, a
Yeah.
dicot, and a monocot, you'd for sure be a tree array, right?
So you want us to like classify this kind of classify.
Okay.
Is this kind of like what you want? They have this. But then click on it.
Okay, so what I'd like you to tell me is kind of how it fits into this bigger structure that we've been talking about, right?
Okay.
So we have, right, we have our grouping of all our plants, right?
Mhm.
So do you happen to know, I don't know that species off the top of my head.
Oh, no, it's just like one of the carnivore
Okay.
plants. Yeah.
Yeah, so sort of work backwards. So this is one genus.
Yeah.
So if you pick one, on the side here, look, like it tells you it's an angiosperm, it's a eudicot. So
Okay.
then you could go through here now, right? And goes into the caryophyllates. Well, like
Okay.
that's kind of what I'm talking about, basically. It's just like situate it relative to the
So like,
different groups of plants that we've talked about.
okay, so for like my example, it would just have to go with that then,
Mhm, yeah, basically.
and then just explain that, or just
Yeah,
I don't have to draw like one of those. So do I, or would you want one?
you don't, but you might as well just like kind of pull.
That one?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Like,
All right, thank you.
Yep.